in this course, we are going to try different strategies for authentication. We're going to try username and password authentication, OAuth authentication, and JDBT authentication. So in this episode, we are going to implement the username and password authentication with Password.js library. This is Sakura Dev channel, and you are watching the episode 14 of our NestJS full course. All right, let's get started. Okay, so I open up our NestJS project, and in the first step, we need to create the Auth module. So I open up the terminal, and here, as you know, I'm going to say nestg. Now, since we are going to create the Auth controller and Auth service, we are going to create a resource here. So I'm going to call it Auth and then -- no spec, because I don't want to create the test files for this module. We're going to choose the REST API, and we don't want to create the CRUD entry point. So just put no here. And as you can see, it creates the Auth module for us, Auth controller, and also Auth service. All right, now let's install the dependencies. So let's first clear this up, and I'm going to install 3 packages here: the NestJS/passport, the passport itself, and also passport-local, which is responsible for authenticating users with a username and password. So let's install these 3 packages. Okay, we also need to install the types of the passport. So let's install a dev dependency here at types/passport-local. All right, since we are going to authenticate the users with a username and password, we need to create a method in the user service for retrieving a user based on its username. So now let's do that and go to the user module and the user service, where we can use the user repo. We have already declared a find one method which find the user based on its ID. We are going to create another function that retrieve the user based on its username. So here we're going to create another function, async find by username, and we can just name it find by email because we are going to use the email of the user as its username. So we just name it find by email, and it takes the email, which is going to be a string, and then it just use the user repo to find the user based on its email. So we're going to return and await for the user repo, this user repo, and then call the find one function, pass the configuration object, specify the where, and we just put the email inside it. So it will retrieve the user based on the email parameter. Okay, now we need to go to the Auth service, and then here create a method named validate user. This method actually calls the user service find by email method and retrieve the user by its email, and then it needs to check the password of the user. So here we're just going to create this method, async validate user. Okay, it takes the email, which is going to be a string, and the password, which is going to be a string as well. Okay, and then here we need to call the user service find by email function. Before injecting the user service into this class and use it here, let me explain that this email and user comes from our login API. So when the client tries to log in into our application, it should provide the email and the password. And we use this email to find the user first and then check its password with the password of the retrieved user from our database. And then based on that, we can decide whether the user is authenticated or not. Okay, so now let's inject the user service here, add the constructor and private user service, and it's going to be type of user service class. Okay, now let's put the body of the constructor, and before using the user service here, let's register the user service inside the providers list of the Auth module. Otherwise we got an error during the runtime. So we should register the user service here in the providers list of the Auth module. Now let's get back to the Auth service. Now we can use the user service here. So in the first step, we need to retrieve the user based on its email. So I'm going to say const user and then call this the user service dot find by email method. And then we just need to pass the email to this function. Now here, we need to check if the user is null. We're going to throw an unauthorized exception. So here, we're going to check if not user, which means that the user is null. Then we're going to throw new unauthorized exception that comes from the next/common. And then we can pass a message to the client. For example, user not found. Okay, so if the user is not null and we pass this exception trap, we're going to check the provided password by the user from the login API with the hashed version of the retrieved user password. So here we're going to say const is password match and then call the compare function of the bcrypt package to compare the plain provided password by the user with the hashed version of the user in our database. So we're going to call the compare function from the bcrypt, and since this is a async function, we're going to wait for that, and then in the first parameter we're going to pass the password, and in the second parameter we're going to pass the user dot password. So again, this user dot password comes from our database which has been hashed, and this is the plain password that the user provide in the login API. I have explained in the previous episode of this course why we don't need to provide the number of salt rounds to this compare function, because the number of salt for hashing the user password is integrated inside the hashed version of the password. So we don't need to provide the number of salt round here. And it is crucial to note that we should put the await here. Otherwise, this compare function will return a promise, and when in the next line we are going to check is password match, it always be true. So our password checking will not work correctly. So make sure to put the await for the compare function. All right, in the next line, as I said, we're going to check the is password match, and we're going to check it. If it is false, we're going to throw a no exception again, actually an unauthorized exception with a message, for example, invalid credential. Okay, now if we just pass the second exception trap, we can return just a user object. So we can return the user object here. But this is not a good idea to return the entire user object, because first of all, we don't need the all data about the user. And second, the user object here contains the password of the user, and we don't want to return the password inside the returning user object. So we just return a object that only contains the ID of the user. Later in this course, you can see how we can use these data in order to create a JWT token for the user. All right, that's it for the validate user function of the auth service. We're going to use this function in our local strategy, as you will see in a second. All right, now we need to create the passport strategy for authenticating the users with a username and password. But before creating our strategy here, let me quickly explain what are passport strategies in the first place. So passport strategies are essentially authentication mechanisms that define how a user can prove their identity to your application. So actually they define the way we authenticate our users, and Passport.js offers different strategies for authenticating the users. For example, here in this episode, we're going to have a local strategy that authenticate users based on a username and password that's stored locally in our application's database. So that's why it's called local strategy. The other common passport strategies are Auth 2 strategies that allow users to be authenticated using their accounts from popular providers like Google and Facebook. So in the upcoming section of this course, we're going to use the Auth 2 strategies. But in this episode, we're going to use local strategy. And as I said, it is going to authenticate our users with a username and password that are locally stored in our database. So now in the Auth module, we're going to create another directory. We're going to call it strategies. And inside it, we're going to define our passport strategies. So the name of this directory actually doesn't matter, but I think the strategies is an appropriate name for it. So then inside it, we're going to create our local strategy. So I'm going to create a file, and I'm going to call it local.strategy.ts. And inside it, we're going to create a class named local strategy. So here I'm going to export a class named local strategy, and it should extend the strategy that is exported from the passport local module. So I'm going to use extends here and then call the passport strategy function that comes from the NestJS/passport, and then pass the strategy which comes from the passport local. Okay, as you can see, this strategy is exported from the passport local. Okay, and then before start writing the body of this class, let me just mark it with injectable decorator. So now it is a injectable class that can be injected to other classes by NestJS. Then here we're going to define the constructor, and inside it we're going to inject the auth service. So here we're going to use private auth service, which its type is going from the auth service class. Okay, now inside the constructor we need to call the super class. So let's call the constructor of the super class, and then here inside it we can pass a configuration object, and we can define a custom name for our username field. And in this project we're going to use the email of the user as its username. So here we're going to use a option called username field, and then we're going to specify our custom name, which is going to be email. Okay, now we can also define a custom password field if your password field is not actually named password. For example, if you have a field called pass which serves as your password, you're going to set the password field option and pass the actual name of your password field. So since our password just is password, we don't want to rename the password field. Okay, now let's go out of the constructor, and then here we need to define a function called validate, and it takes the username field, which is going to be email, its type is string, and the password field type is also string. And in this function we need to call the auth service.validate user and just pass the email and password to it. So I'm going to return this auth service and then call validate user and just pass email and password. So actually this strategy will collect the email and password from the body of our login API and just pass them to the validate function here. And as you can see, the validate function calls the auth service.validate user, and the authentication goes on. And also the returning object of this validate function will be appended to the request object under the name user. You will see in a minute how we can extract the user object out of the request object in our HTTP login endpoint. So we're almost done with our local strategy authentication. We just need to register the local strategy in our auth module. So here we're going to register the local strategy class that we have just written inside the providers list of the auth module. And also, since we have used the user service in which we call the user repository, we need to register the user repository here. So inside the import section of this module, we're going to use typeORM module. We're going to pass typeORM module and call for feature function, and then inside a list just pass the user entity. Okay, so we have registered our user repository inside the auth module and also local strategy inside the provider section of this module. Okay, now let's save this, and we need to go to the auth controller, and here we just need to create a post request for the login endpoint. So we use @post here and set its route to login, so it can be called under the route /auth then /login. Then we're going to create a function for it. I'm going to call it just login, and then we need to specify which passport strategy we are going to use for this route. So here we can use guards decorator from the NestJS/common, and then call the authguard function, which comes from the NestJS/passport, and then here we're going to define the name of the strategy, which is going to be local. And so now when the user call the login API, first it goes through the authguard with the local strategy, and the local strategy will look for a email and password field inside the body of the request and just pass them to the validate function of the local strategy, and our authentication process is starting from this endpoint. So now let's go to Insomnia and call the login API. So first let me check the terminal. We don't have any error. So I just go to the Insomnia, and here let me send a post request to the /auth/login. And here, as you can see, we have provided the email and password fields inside the body of this post request. So if I send the request here, as you can see, the status code is 201, which shows that we don't have any error and we don't have anybody, because here in the auth controller, in the login API, we don't return anything, but we don't have any error, which means that our authentication was successful. For example, let me change the password here and send the request. You can see unauthorized error, which says invalid credentials. So as you can see, our login API works correctly. Now let's get back to the login API. And as I said, the returning object of the validate function from the local strategy will be appended to the request object under the name of the user. So we can access the request object with @request decorator, which comes from the NestJS/common, and let's call it rec. And here we can just return rec.user. Let's save this and also put the parentheses for the request decorator. Let's save this and get back to Insomnia. Let's provide a correct password and send the request to the login API. You can see now we have just returned an object that contains the ID of the authenticated users. So again, as you can see, the authentication process was successful. And now let's change the HTTP status code for this post API. As you can see, it is 201 created, which is the default HTTP status code for the post endpoint. So now I get back to VS Code, and here I'm going to use the decorator HTTP code and set it to HTTP status.OK. Let's save this and get back to Insomnia. Now let's send the post request. As you can see, now the status code is 200 OK. All right, and now let's get back to VS Code, and I'm going to show you how we can create a custom guard for the local strategy. As you can see here, we have just used the use guard with the auth guard function and pass the local string to it. We can create just a custom auth guard for our local strategy. So I just open up the terminal, and here I'm going to create it with the nest CLI, nest.gu, which stands for guards, and I'm going to create it inside the auth module and then guards directory. So the guards directory doesn't exist yet. It will create the guards directory, and then we're going to create a local auth guard. As you can see, it creates the guards directory for us, and inside it creates local auth.guard.ts. Let me first close this off, and we don't want this section. We just need to extend and just call the auth guard function and just pass the local string to it. Let's save this. We don't want to do anything with this local guard, and I go back to the auth controller. Now we can just use the local auth guard that we have just created with the use guard decorator. Let's save this and get back to Insomnia and send the request. You can see it works just like before without any error. So yeah, in this way you can create a custom guard for a strategy. So now let me quickly do a recap here. First, we just create our local strategy and use the local auth guard, which actually activate the local strategy for this login route. So when the client send a request to this endpoint, local strategy will be activated. It looks for the email and password inside the body section of the incoming request, and then it calls the validate function, and inside it we're going to call the auth service.validate user and pass the email and password that local strategy extracted from the body of the incoming post request. Then inside the validate user, first we call the user service and find by email function, pass the email, it retrieve the user by its email from our database, and then we're going to check if the user is null, which means that the user was not found. We just throw an unauthorized exception, user not found. Then we're going to check the password with the compare function of the bcrypt module. So if returns false, we're going to just throw an unauthorized exception again with invalid credentials message. Then if we pass these two checking section, we just return an object in which we just pass the ID of the user. Then here in the local strategy, we just return that object, which as I said will be appended to the request object under the name user. It is done by the local strategy of the passport.js. So I hope this makes sense to you. Actually, the first time I used the local strategy, I was a little confused about how local strategy works in our authentication process, but I hope you understand how it works with this concise explanation. So that's it for the local strategy. It just authenticate the user with the username and password. In the next episode, you will see how we can use this user object for creating a JWT token, and then we can pass the JWT token to the user. The user can keep it inside a cookie, and then we can protect our APIs with that JWT token. So every time the user wants to access a JWT protected API, it should provide that JWT token inside its header or inside a HTTP only cookie. So that's it for this episode, and in the next episode we are going to protect our routes with JWT, and then we are going to provide a refresh token functionality for our application. So stay tuned for the next video. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to the channel, and with subscribing to my channel you can support me grow faster in YouTube. And if this video was helpful for you, please hit the like button. Have a nice time and stay tuned for my next video. Bye bye.